If you carry type O positive blood, you are holding a genetic passport stamped by ancient wanderers, a record far older than any written language, any fallen empire, or any border drawn on a map. For the longest time, modern medicine treated your blood type as nothing more than a minor administrative detail. It was just a letter and a plus sign printed on a medical chart to make sure hospital transfusions went smoothly. But the moment researchers finally gained the technology to read the deep DNA hidden inside that single letter, the entire story turned upside down. What the latest genetic tracking has revealed about type O positive carriers is completely rewriting our understanding of who our true ancestors were, how they survived the deadliest, invisible wars in history, and how a small, resilient group of people from the Asian continent quietly passed their genetic blueprint to nearly every population on Earth today. But to understand how your blood remembers a past that your family forgot, we have to look at a massive mistake the scientific world made over a century ago. The year was 1901. A brilliant Austrian researcher named Karl Landsteiner was staring through a microscope, trying to solve a terrifying mystery. Up until that point, giving someone a blood transfusion was basically a game of roulette. Sometimes it saved their life, and sometimes it proved instantly fatal. Landsteiner discovered why. He noticed that if he mixed certain blood samples together, they stayed smooth and liquid, but if he mixed others, they violently clumped up, sticking together like glue. He had just discovered the human blood groups A, B, and O. It was a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough. But almost immediately, Western biologists made a massive assumption. They looked around at the populations of Europe, saw that type A was everywhere, and decided that type A must be the original human blood. To them, type A seemed like the dominant ancestral default of humanity, while type O was just a strange mutation that came later. But that assumption was completely backward. And that brings us to a plot twist hidden deep in our genetic code that nobody saw coming. Decades later, when geneticists finally cracked open the human genome, they didn't just look at the blood itself. They looked at the underlying blueprint, a specific gene sitting quietly on chromosome 9. This gene acts like a factory manager, deciding whether or not to build tiny molecular structures called antigens on the outside of your red blood cells. When researchers started mapping out these genetic blueprints across the entire globe, the patterns they found were absolutely staggering. In Europe, type A was indeed common. In parts of northern India, type B reached incredible levels. But when they tested indigenous populations of the Americas, people whose ancestors had been isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, type O reached levels that defied belief. In some native tribes, nearly 100% of the people carried type O blood. In genetics, this is not necessarily an accident. This can be explained by what scientists call a founder effect. It means that the original small group of people who first settled the Americas carried a high frequency of type O blood, and they passed it down to every generation that followed. But where did those original populations come from? Evidence from ancient skeletons and genetic studies shows that the ancestors of Native Americans came from populations in Asia. They survived the brutal conditions of a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, and they brought their genetic inheritance with them. Today, Asia still holds a massive reservoir of type O genetics. If you look at populations across countries such as the Philippines and Vietnam, type O remains common. And while Asia is incredibly diverse and carries all blood types, the type O genetic signature is widespread. When scientists examine genetic variation surrounding the ABO gene in modern populations around the world, they can investigate how these patterns developed and spread through human history. But this raises a massive question. Why did this specific blood type survive and become so common in certain populations? Why didn't it fade away? The answer has less to do with the freezing cold of the Ice Age or the dangers of wild predators and more to do with an invisible war. Throughout human history, some of the greatest threats to human survival were microscopic killers, diseases, parasites, and bacteria. And it turns out that blood type can influence how the body interacts with some of these threats. Let's look at malaria. For hundreds of thousands of years, malaria has been one of the most ruthless killers of humanity. When the malaria parasite enters the human body, it infects red blood cells. Type O blood has characteristics that can reduce the tendency of infected red blood cells to form the large clumps associated with severe malaria. Research has shown that people with type O blood have a lower risk of developing severe malaria compared with people carrying some other ABO blood types. This means a person with type O blood can have a greater chance of surviving severe malaria and living long enough to have children. Over many generations, differences like this can influence the distribution of blood. Types and populations exposed to malaria. If you think that's an incredible advantage, there is another fascinating example, norovirus. Norovirus is a highly contagious stomach virus that can spread rapidly through communities, schools, and cruise ships. Some strains interact differently with the molecules found on the digestive tract of people with different blood group types. Because of these differences, susceptibility can vary depending on the individual's genetics and the particular strain of the virus. Across thousands of years, even a small biological advantage against a widespread disease could potentially influence how common a blood type became in a population. And it helps explain why blood group frequencies differ so dramatically around the world. But nature is the ultimate accountant. It never hands you a gift without handing you a bill. This brings us to the hidden cost of type O positive blood. The same biological characteristics associated with some protection against severe malaria can also be associated with increased vulnerability to other conditions. Take cholera, for example. In places such as the Ganges Delta, where cholera has been a deadly force for centuries, research has found that people with type O blood can experience more severe disease during cholera outbreaks. The cholera toxin interacts with the intestinal environment, and studies have found differences in disease severity associated with ABO blood group. This is actually a fascinating piece of natural history. It shows how the environment can shape the distribution of blood types over generations. Then there is the issue of your stomach. If you have type O blood, some research has linked it with a higher risk of developing certain peptic ulcers, particularly in connection with Helicobacter pylori. This spiral-shaped bacterium can colonize the stomach lining and cause inflammation and ulcers. And if you want a lighter but equally annoying trade-off, there are mosquitoes. Some studies have found that mosquitoes can show different feeding preferences depending on blood group, with certain research suggesting that type O individuals may be bitten more frequently than type A individuals. So type O positive is a complex inheritance. It is a masterclass in survival built on a delicate balance of risks and rewards. But just when scientists thought they had the type O map perfectly figured out, an entirely new mystery appeared. In 1952, a patient was admitted to a hospital in Bombay, now Mumbai. The patient needed a transfusion and appeared to have type O blood. But when doctors gave the patient standard type O blood, the patient's body reacted severely. The medical staff was baffled. How could type O reject type O? When researchers looked deeper, they found something stunning. Think of blood types like building a house. Types A and B are the roof. Type O is the basic foundation, built around a molecule called the H antigen. But this patient didn't even have the foundation. This condition became known as the Bombay phenotype. Under basic testing, it can appear similar to type O because there are no A or B antigens. But it is fundamentally different. People with the Bombay phenotype generally require blood from compatible Bombay phenotype donors because their immune systems can react against the H antigen found on ordinary O blood. In most of the world, this genetic condition is extremely rare, but it is more common in parts of the Indian subcontinent. The Bombay phenotype is a brilliant reminder that even within the story of type O, there are ancient and localized genetic variations that standard blood typing can miss. When you zoom out and look at the grand timeline of humanity, the journey of this blood type is nothing short of a cinematic epic. Around 5,000 years ago, seafaring populations from what is now Taiwan began expanding across the Pacific. They built outrigger canoes and gradually settled islands across the largest ocean on Earth. They reached places including Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, and among many Polynesian populations, type O is common. Two highly isolated groups of people, indigenous peoples of the Americas and Polynesian populations of the Pacific, are separated by an enormous ocean, yet both have deep genetic connections to ancient populations of Asia. Today, modern medicine is still uncovering how blood type can influence your biology. We know that people with type O generally have lower levels of certain clotting proteins, including von Willebrand factor and factor VIII, than people with non-O blood types. This is associated with a lower risk of certain blood clots and cardiovascular events. But there is a trade-off. Lower levels of clotting factors can also contribute to a higher risk of bleeding in some circumstances. Every biological trait is part of a larger evolutionary story. So, what does all of this mean for you today, living in the modern world? The next time you look at a medical chart and see the letter O followed by a plus sign, do not just see a chemical category. Realize what you are looking at. You are looking at a biological trait shaped by thousands of generations of human history. Somewhere in the distant past, your ancestors lived through river valleys, freezing landscapes, and dense, humid environments. They faced infectious diseases, harsh climates, food shortages, and countless other challenges. Those who survived passed their genes forward, generation after generation, until that same genetic blueprint eventually reached you. You are the living result of that long evolutionary journey. Your veins are carrying a biological history book, and modern science is finally learning how to read its pages. If this journey into the hidden history of your DNA changed the way you look at yourself, I want to hear from you. Let me know what your blood type is and where in the world your family comes from. Thank you.